Well, welcome everybody. As you find your spots, and I hope you've filled your plates and are looking forward to a nourishing lunch hour in all sorts of ways, I'm delighted to welcome you to our signal session of the Osgoode Colloquium in Law, Religion, Social Thought. For those of you that are new to the sessions, this began about 2 years ago, and we've had a wonderful set of speakers and papers delivered through this colloquium, which is meant really to bring an interdisciplinary lens into the law school to look at issues of religion, politics, diversity, social thought together. And today we're very fortunate to have another exceptional speaker in the series. I'm delighted to welcome Professor Elizabeth Shakman Hurd from Northwestern University, where she's a professor in the Department of Political Science and cross-appointed to the Department of Religion. Professor Shakman Hurd does wonderful work and is indeed one of my favorite commentators to track in issues of religion and diversity, U.S. foreign relations, and the ways that those circulate around issues of religion. And of course, that's very much at the heart of the talk today, something that's very germane to what's happening in Canada these days, as you all well know. Professor Shakman Hurd has done really remarkably interesting work in international relations, religion, and Turkey, Iran. I brought with me her award-winning book, The Politics of Secularism in International Relations. And if you're interested in any of the components of that, the study of the political, the study of secularism and religion, the study of international relations, the integration of all of those lenses, which is, to my mind, the defining feature of our guest's scholarship, the literate, very informed capacity to move between these different fields, is incredibly rewarding, and I urge that book on you. But today we have an opportunity to hear what's on Professor Shakman Hurd's mind right now, and I'm delighted to welcome her to Osgoode and to the colloquium, and thank you all for coming today as well.
Hi, everybody. Thank you, Ben, for such a warm welcome. It's fabulous to be here. I've never been here before, so I really appreciate the opportunity. Today, I'm going to be talking about the politics of religious freedom, and I'm going to start with an anecdote to try to put on the table right away some of the issues that we're dealing with. Many of you may have heard in January, just a few weeks ago, an historic library in Tripoli, Lebanon, was attacked by an arsonist and burned to the ground. It was owned and operated by a Greek Orthodox priest named Father Ibrahim Sarouj. And the arson took place after rumors had circulated that Father Sarouj may have written or had in his library, the accounts varied and were rather unclear, an online article that insulted Islam and the Prophet Muhammad. So after the attack, there was a strong and immediate local response that condemned the violence. Local leaders emphasized long-standing cross-cutting connections between various parts of the Tripoli community. And prominent members of civil society, including a representative of the Lebanese Internal Security Forces, a local MP, a local Salafi sheikh, and a former prime minister, all rushed to his defense, insisting that he had nothing to do with the article, suggesting those who seek to incite any form of intercommunal strife and violence in Tripoli would be shunned and even imprisoned. The Salafi sheikh, Salam al-Rafai, gave an interview to the Daily Star, and in which he stated, quote, "The Syrian regime seeks to show that Muslims in Tripoli are extremists and don't accept other people, and the Damascus regime can alone protect minorities," end quote. Civil society groups gathered outside the library and collected donations to rebuild. So, advocates for international religious freedom told a very different story about this incident, which you may have heard about. Nina Shea, the director of the Hudson Institute Center for Religious Freedom in New York and a longtime international religious freedom advocate, stated that, quote, "Flames of a violent hysteria against all perceived threats to Islam are spreading rapidly through the Muslim world today." Robert George, chair of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or USCIRF, lamented that the really bad news is that this isn't even out of the ordinary. And he then cited the need to promote religious freedom to prevent these attacks. Now, there are a number of things that could be said about George's call for the deployment of religious freedom as a means of preventing this arson. One could, for example, point to the contrast between the local response in the community, which was a coming together across various lines of difference, and the response from Shea and George, which was a coming apart across lines, deep religious lines of division. One could also question the equivalencies created through George and Shea's words and actions between the Tripoli event and other episodes elsewhere in the world, all of which become reduced to episodes of religious violence and attributed to a lack of religious freedom and religious tolerance. It's common for religious freedom advocates to reduce very different episodes with very different contexts and causal features at play to something called religious violence or violence against Christians. When this happens, we lose sight of the broader context. Other factors, such as, for example, in this case, the very specific political context, the regional political context of the Syrian war that was mentioned by the Salafi Sheikh, which is absolutely very relevant to this case, are completely lost from sight. We see only persecution. That's all we can see. So, motivated by these and related concerns, the question I want to ask today is, what happens when religion becomes a platform from which to conduct foreign policy and human rights advocacy? So I'm talking about states, their foreign policy establishments, but I'm also talking more broadly about a movement that's kind of come together, percolating, coalescing globally, that involves human rights advocates who are in various relationships to state establishments, maybe inside, maybe in NGOs, maybe revolving in and out. So it's kind of non-governmental and governmental. So the promotion of religious freedom, I'm going to argue, involves an attempt to govern social difference through religious rights. Governing difference through religious rights is one particular form of governance that I'm going to suggest naturalizes the very boundaries that it seeks to mediate or transcend. Borrowing a phrase from the historian Sarah Shields, religious freedom advocacy leads to a particular ecology of affiliation. Is it possible then, I'm going to ask today, that a norm that is intended to secure human flourishing and peaceful coexistence could at times enact the opposite? Now, this is not the usual story about religious freedom. In the US, religious freedom, as I'm sure you know, is referred to as the first freedom, and it's considered widely to be one of the building blocks of the post-World War II international human rights edifice. The US, of course, has been a leader in external religious freedom advocacy for many decades, particularly during the Cold War, although that history is often forgotten, I've discovered. At that time, the goal was to promote what was called global spiritual health, which was kind of another way of promoting anti-communism. I could talk about that in the Q&A. It's kind of an interesting historical moment if anyone's interested. The mandate, the global spiritual health mandate, was rejuvenated and kind of brought back to life under different geopolitical circumstances about 2 decades ago under the Clinton administration with the passage of the International Religious Freedom Act of 1998, which is also known rather unceremoniously as IRFA. So most Americans have never heard of IRFA. If asked, most vaguely associate US religious freedom promotion with pressuring governments to observe minority rights, and most consider it to be a good thing. We have religious freedom, and it's time to export it. Many Americans also affirm a divine origin of the right to religious freedom. The National Association of Evangelicals describes it as a God-given human right occupying a privileged position above other rights claims, and they actually led the advocacy and the lobbying efforts in favor of the 1998 legislation. But let me emphasize that it's not only evangelicals. Religious freedom advocacy enjoys a very broad constituency that spans the political spectrum, and this is one of the things that makes it so interesting. Almost everyone is for it, because there is something for everyone. Liberal legal internationalists locate religious freedom alongside other universal human rights as a pragmatic norm of global solidarity, human solidarity, and a polite extension of Rawls's famous dictum, political, not metaphysical. In Ben Berger's felicitous phrase summarizing this perspective, in this view, law is seen as the curator rather than a component of cultural pluralism. Support for religious freedom also includes those for whom some form of Christianity serves as the foundation of human rights, democracy, and freedom itself. An example of this strand is the Berkeley Center at Georgetown, whose project, called Christianity and Freedom, describes itself as, quote, an attempt to explore Christianity's contribution to the construction and diffusion of freedom, end quote. This engenders a logic in which, as Melanie McAllister has pointed out in a recent issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly, political support for Christianity, even for Christian dominance, is actually support for both human rights and religious freedom for all. American nationalists, for whom the city on a hill narrative still resonates, with long-standing ideals of American exceptionalism, also support religious freedom advocacy, as do many European human rights advocates who are concerned, in particular in a post-Arab Spring world, with the fate of persecuted Christians in the MENA region, and missionaries for whom religious liberalization signals an openness to their missions that may not have been felt or framed in the same way in previous decades. So this is a very potent combination of forces and different bedfellows, you could say, that's all coalescing to propel these initiatives forward. We have national security advocates, human rights activists, advocates for persecuted Christians, many others, all standing for religious freedom. It's not only evangelicals, and it is not only Republicans. It is also not only the United States, as you know. Canada, European states, the UK, and the EU are all institutionalizing official external religious freedom programming. The UN has been doing this for decades. A year ago, Prime Minister Harper launched an Office of Religious Freedom at DFATE that is modeled on the US State Department office, explicitly. The British and the EU are promoting religious freedom through the FCO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the European External Action Service. Since 2009, in fact, the FCO has distributed what they call a toolkit on how to help promote respect for this human right. That's what the toolkit is titled. A European Parliament Working Group on Religious Freedom presented their first detailed report earlier this month. It was just released. And they actually brought a whole bunch of members from the US Commission on International Religious Freedom over to receive it and to celebrate it. There are a number of bilateral initiatives that are expanding as well, with Italy particularly interested. Now, all of these initiatives share a benign view of religious freedom as a stable fundamental human right, legal standard, and social fact that can be objectively measured and achieved by all political collectivities. It's just a matter of persuading people and governments to come to their senses, to comply with a universal standard, a standard that leads to peace, harmony, and prosperity. States and societies in this view are positioned along a spectrum of progress. They are inclined either toward the achievement of religious freedom, or they slipping backwards into religious persecution and violence, caused, we're told, by religious hatred, general backwardness, or cultural immaturity. The US IRFA legislation somewhat circuitously attributes the failure to achieve religious freedom to a lack of cultural understanding. It actually says in the legislation, in many nations where severe violations of religious freedom occur, there is not sufficient cultural and social understanding of international norms of religious freedom. So in other words, education is in order. So I became interested in this topic because everyone is for it. And as Talal Asad observed of the Universal Declaration, the UDHR, but I think also applies to religious freedom, this is a case in which the rule called law, in effect, usurps the entire universe of moral discourse. The dominant narrative of religious freedom presumes a direct convergence between the rule of law, understood as the universal right to religious freedom enforced through law. This could be domestic law, it could be various international legal instruments, a convergence between the rule of law and social justice. It presumes this convergence. With this move, then, religious freedom captures the fields of emancipatory possibility, as Paul Kennedy has said of human rights. And this equation of law with justice, with social justice, raises a number of concerns. And this has been obviously a subject of an enormous literature that I cannot go into here. John Komaroff has been writing about this recently. Talal Asad argues that the equation between law and justice actually privileges the state's norm-defining function, thereby encouraging the thought that the authority of norms corresponds to the political force that supports them as law. So what we have here is an effacing of the distinction between law and social justice, and I think that that characterizes what is going on in the field of religious freedom advocacy today. Now, these concerns have multiplied the more familiar I've become with the very specific histories and politics that take place under the rubric of religious freedom. Over the past 3 years, I've co-directed the Politics of Religious Freedom project, which is a 3-year, now 4-year project funded by the Luce Foundation in New York to basically attempt to redescribe the historical and cultural assumptions that underlie national and international projects to promote religious freedom. So it's a project that's global in scope. We have found that religious freedom is in fact not at all easily reduced to a single narrative or a single explanatory frame, and we've sought to unsettle the agreement that's ubiquitous in policy circles that religious freedom is a singular achievement, something that's easily understood, and that the problem lies in its incomplete realization. So what I'm going to do for today, the rest and the remainder of my time here, is to talk about my own piece of this work, which focuses on the deployment of religious freedom very specifically as an international political project. And what I'm interested in is what the effects are of these efforts for everyday lived religion around the world. In other words, what difference does it make when states and other authorities manage social difference through the prism of religion and religious rights by advocating for religious freedom, religious toleration, the rights of religious minorities, and religious engagement? And I have different chapters of my book that are going to deal with each of those issues because they all set in motion slightly different social and political dynamics. I'm not going to be able to open them all up in the course of 25 minutes, but I can suggest some of these dynamics. And I'm going to focus specifically on the religious freedom question. And what I'm going to suggest is that the deployment of religious freedom it works in a number of different registers, as a discursive ideal, as a universal norm, and as a technique or strategy of governance, actually shapes contemporary religion and contemporary religious governance in 3 specific ways. And I'm going to take these one at a time and kind of walk through them with some examples. First, I'm going to let you drink water. So the first example is that, or the first sort of effect, you could say, of consequence of the promotion or deployment of religious freedom as a political project internationally is that, quite simply, and this seems very obvious, but it has interesting consequences politically, is that it singles out individuals and groups for legal protection as religions and as religious groups. So this means that people and groups are described, approached, engaged, and legally defined, oftentimes, in religious or sectarian terms rather than on the basis of any number of other affiliations that people hold. For example, social class, historical ties, neighborhood bonds, kinship networks, professional associations, the list goes on. So in positing religion as something that is somehow prior to or more fundamental to these other identities and affiliations, the religious rights model elevates the political salience of whatever counts as religion or whatever is denominated as religion in these different contexts. And I want to be clear that I think that that is itself a political and legal process that other people have written about very eloquently, such as Winnie Sullivan, for example. So religious identity and difference are slowly taken to be some kind of natural or normal foundation of social order. They're seen as just the way things are. Religion is taken as special, as different, as prior to other ties. And I think that this logic lends itself, without saying that it causes, because I'm very hesitant to make causal claims in really strong terms, the way many political scientists like to do. But I think that this logic lends itself to a confessionalization of public life. So particular forms of religious difference and religious secular difference become ossified. Basic categories of social conflict and coexistence become framed in religious terms. Social tensions and conflicts that have, as always, multiple contributing factors are depoliticized, removed from the field of politics when their causes are explained away through reference to some kind of intractable religious difference. And what I want to do is just turn to a couple examples here to see what happens when groups are singled out for protection on the basis of religion. One is the post-Arab Spring Middle East. It's not really post-Arab Spring, and it's not really an Arab Spring, and all of these words are problematic. But the contemporary Middle East and North Africa, and the second is the current situation in Myanmar or Burma. One involves protection of Christians and the other Muslims, but these dynamics travel remarkably well, unfortunately. So calls for the protection of Christians and other minorities in Syria, Egypt, and neighboring countries have been a cornerstone of European and North American rights advocacy in the wake of the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa. It is increasingly common for policy elites on both sides of the Atlantic to respond to these changes and these ongoing contestations and transformations in the region through a religious rights framework that stresses the rights of religious minorities, in particular persecuted Christians. So a couple examples. In a speech last year, the religious affairs advisor at the French Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Roland de Bertrand, noted that the French diplomats had been shocked, in his words, by the Arab Spring, which had propelled Christian minorities into the spotlight in France, forcing Europeans to grapple with the question of, as he put it, how do we find policy toward Eastern Christians and mobilize more at the European and UN level? A similar script dominates American policy discussions. In the US, developments in the region have been read and framed and responded to through the prism of minority, usually Christian rights and freedoms. A couple examples. We had last August Senator Roy Blunt of Missouri, who introduced the Near East and South Asia Religious Freedom Act of 2013, aimed at protecting the rights of religious minorities. This legislation would create a new special envoy for religious freedom to monitor and combat acts of religious intolerance and incitement, and these are direct quotes from the proposed legislation, and to ensure that the unique needs of religious communities, religious minority communities, are addressed. So they want to allocate $1 million for these activities, and this enjoys total bipartisan support. So the rising primacy of what the US government has called the religion factor, and they use all of these terms, the operationalization, the strategic operationalization of religion, the religion factor. I was thinking of calling my book The Religion Factor, but that only lasted a couple hours. But the rising primacy of this idea of the religion factor is, I think, driving efforts by North American and European governments, and as I said, a host of, this long, big raft of NGOs and international organizations and a whole bunch of other folks, to attempt to do a very specific thing, which is to secure equality and justice abroad by recognizing religious people and religious communities in law, and then seeking to guarantee their religious freedom. So these measures explicitly adopt religion as a category, as the category, to draw together individuals and communities as corporate bodies that then are depicted as in need of legal protection to guarantee their freedom. That's kind of a long sentence. But taking religion as a platform, and this is sort of the key to my argument, taking religion as a platform from which to make foreign policy, taking that as a starting point already sets in motion a number of consequences. For example, it totally obscures the original impetus for the revolts in the MENA region, which was calls for government accountability, fair and just governance, human dignity, an end to dictatorship, economic opportunity. But the problem with the religion factor also runs deeper, because the structural logic of promoting Christian rights or Hindu rights or Muslim rights, as I've said, contributes to a sectarianization of the social order. It contributes to what William Connolly has called a drive to overcode a particular set of boundaries. Boundaries between religions, as I said, but also boundaries between religious and secular. So this is similar to an argument that Jane and John Komaroff have developed in their book Ethnicity, Inc. And they have argued this in regard to ethnicity, but I'm arguing it with regard to religion, suggesting that religion starts to appear in tractable, alienable form. And then lodged within this regime, within this discursive regime, is an imperative. Well, there are a number of imperatives, but one of them is you need to define your identity in religious terms. Are you this or are you that? You got to know who you are, you got to know what you are in order to know where you fit in. So individuals that have multiple affiliations, mixed backgrounds, those that dissent from dominant protected forms of religion, favored by the government, favored by the US, favored by Canada, are uneasily accommodated into these rubrics of religious identity and difference that are becoming more and more reified and oppositional. Some people fall between the cracks of these overcoded boundaries and become subject to what Bill Connolly describes as the violence accompanying these codes. These in-between people find themselves in an impossible position, as Elizabeth Castelli has pointed out. Either they have to make political claims on religious grounds, or they have no ground from which to speak. Those are your options. Let's take another example, the predicament of the Rohingya people in Myanmar. How many of you guys know about the Rohingya people? Okay, I gave a talk where I talked about the Rohingya in Brussels 6 weeks ago, and no one had ever heard of them. We couldn't figure out what was going on, but we finally figured it out. Anyway, so the current predicament of the Rohingya people. So, like many groups, the historical and ethnographic history and the details of the Rohingya situation is extraordinarily complex, like all groups, really. They are effectively right now, and I'm going to jump over most of the history like a good political scientist and just go to the present. Who needs it, right? It's over. They're effectively stateless. They are persecuted by the Burmese government and other societal, communal, and business interests. So the discrimination against the Rohingya is multifaceted. It is ethnic, it is racial, it is economic, it is religious, and it is national. It's difficult to say at any given moment which of these factors is causing a particular incident of violence or a discriminatory act or act of exclusion in any particular situation or confrontation. When the US Commission on International Religious Freedom, and most of the media actually, identify the Rohingya as persecuted Muslims, what this does is it effectively singles out religion as the prime factor from amongst a very complex web of discriminatory forces that are interwoven with each other. The Rohingya's lives are miserable, we are told, because they are Muslims, and Burmese people don't like Muslims. So they're religiously intolerant people, and that's motivating the violence against them. The solution, guarantee their religious freedom. It all sort of follows. You can just see it coming. So in this case, promoting religious rights and freedoms, if you think about this for a moment, singles out the Rohingya on religious grounds. It stresses their identity as Muslims rather than as Burmese citizens, as humans, as members of various communal associations, who are part of various professions, et cetera, et cetera. This emphasis on the difference that religion allegedly makes plays directly and tragically into the hands of the violently exclusionary Buddhist nationalist monks organization known as 969. 969 exists in order to rid Burma of Muslims, and it relies on a popular perception of hard and fast lines of Muslim-Buddhist difference and immutable connections between majoritarian Buddhist religion, race, and Burmese national identity. It's a toxic combination, and it's a toxic group. They've been compared by some Rohingya advocates to the Ku Klux Klan in the US. So 969, not surprisingly, calls for comprehensive social, economic, and political exclusion of the Rohingya from Burmese state and society in the name of the religious freedom of the Burmese Buddhist majority, which is allegedly threatened by people who are Muslim. So to counter this narrative I'm suggesting, the Rohingya need to be included in Burmese society as humans rather than as Muslims. It is not at all clear to me that outside political advocacy for their religious rights and freedoms helps to achieve this objective. So when we single out and we elevate religion from among many given and chosen affiliations that are held by individuals and groups, this confessionalizes politics and may even play into the hands of groups like 969. When we define discrete religious identities and communities as defining features on a political landscape, this lends authority and it lends authenticity to groups that are called religions. Agency and community come to be defined in what are understood to be religious terms. So we're dealing here with a construct, a very powerful construct that, as Pamela Klassen and Courtney Bender have described the ideology of pluralism, quote, articulates and naturalizes the very boundaries of difference that it seeks to diminish, overcome, or mediate. Okay, that was my first concern. Second concern of three, with adopting religion as a platform from which to conduct foreign policy and human rights advocacy. International religious freedom also shapes how states distinguish and relate to religions through everyday legal and administrative practice. So advocacy for religious freedom, legal regimes that protect religious rights, both presuppose and produce groups as discrete faith communities, communities with clean boundaries and clearly defined orthodoxies. These static bodies of tradition and convention, shockingly, lend themselves to becoming objects of government regulation and reform and engagement, which is the US new thing. We have now an official government religious engagement office. So the religious rights model, in other words, empowers very specific official spokespersons to represent neatly bounded faith communities. To whom? To everyone. Governments, NGOs, IOs, everybody's looking for a religious leader. Take me to your religious leader and we can have an interfaith dialogue. Okay, it's everywhere. It's astonishing. It's incredible. So what this does is this favors clear authority structures, clear hierarchies, and neat boundaries. It also empowers groups that can define themselves convincingly as a religion in the eyes of whoever's in charge and whoever enjoys good relations with the state and whoever's in power. Everybody else not invited to the table. So Noah Solomon is an anthropologist who studies nation building in the new state of South Sudan, which is now undergoing a lot of violence. His work focuses on the creation of a Muslim minority after South Sudanese independence, which happened in July 2011. Solomon wants to ask, what does it mean to be constituted as a religious minority under a regime of religious freedom? South Sudan is a really interesting case because the state has adopted religious freedom formally as part of its new constitutional order, and it formally guarantees the rights of religious minority citizens as religious minorities, including its minority Muslim population. So Solomon wants to know what happens when this group of people is transformed from Southerners who happen to practice Islam into a South Sudanese minority community of believers with a specific retinue of national rights and duties. He's not yet sure what happens, and it's hard to go there right now and find out. But one thing is clear, and this point has been made in his work. In South Sudan, as in the US, as in Canada, as in everywhere, it's often extraordinarily difficult to classify people as believers or non-believers in a single faith tradition. And this matters a great deal when religious freedom is legalized and constitutionalized, as it was in the case of the new state of South Sudan. So, as Solomon points out, and as you probably know, many South Sudanese practice both what falls into this sort of catch-all category of African traditional religions and Christianity or Islam. And they don't draw sharp lines between them. They don't differentiate in a strong way between the various practices. And what happens is that these individuals find themselves in a very difficult position under a regime of religious freedom, which, as I've said, demands these distinct confessional communities, clear hierarchies, clear who's your leader, clear identities. And some of them are rendered religiously illegible. And this is kind of the religion that there's no room for in modernity. As my colleague Bob Orsi puts it, it just kind of won't go away, but there's not really any room for it. People are compelled to choose between what has now become suddenly discrete and different religious traditions. You can't be both. Now, of course, all religions are hybrids, and I would be the last person to deny that. But my point is that the global taking up of religious rights discourse shapes religious possibilities in very particular ways by funneling individuals into these distinct and discrete faith communities and compelling them to choose between. And if they don't choose or they can't choose, they're rendered, at least in part, religiously invisible. At the same time, officially recognized religions gain political standing. The new South Sudanese government has a Bureau of Religious Affairs that registers FBOs, faith-based organizations, rejecting Christian organizations whose constitutions don't line up with biblical chapters or verses, according to one inspector interviewed by Solomon. So the point to take away here is really that the histories and the experiences that shape actual everyday religious practice and religious lives around the world fail to align with the categories and classifications adopted in the name of religious regulation, rights, toleration, reform, and control. There's a gap between the religion chosen for engagement and reform and the rest of the world's religion. People don't seem to see this, and this is what my book is trying to point out. Religious affiliation, belonging, and practice is often unstable, contingent, and messy. Many forms of religious affiliation and experience fit uncomfortably or not at all into an understanding of religion as a normative, singular, bounded cause of political behavior. Many forms of affiliation and experience operate outside the understanding of religion that's presupposed by secular, legal, and administrative management through freedom, tolerance, and rights. Some don't even conform to orthodox understandings of what religion is. So this raises a question of who's authorized to represent all of these various religions now that they've been constituted as faith communities and appear as shadow players in the world of international policy and politics. And there is a push today by governments to identify and to engage with religious leaders, both at home and abroad. And we're seeing that here in Canada right now. And as I mentioned, in August of last year, of 2013, the US State Department announced the establishment of a new office to pursue religious engagement globally. Religious engagement effectively empowers leaders who are designated as official religious spokespersons. So as I said, groups with good relations with the authorities will benefit the most. Less established religions, ways of life that don't qualify as religions, none of them are at the table. So governing difference through religious rights, to sum up this point, means that the government has to choose among religious groups and authorities. As Winnie Sullivan has shown in her work in the intersection of law and religion in the United States, it's not possible for the government to take all religions equally seriously. This is an important point. It is simply impossible. So this may be okay with a lot of people, but the fact is the government has to choose, and this involves what Sullivan and Laurie Beeman have referred to in their new volume as varieties of religious establishment. Some are privileged and others are marginalized. As our recently, our former US Ambassador at Large for International Religious Freedom, Suzanne Johnson Cook, stated at a meeting last summer, quote, "There are certain areas where the US government has muscle, and we can also promote religious leaders," end quote. She recently stepped down, by the way. No, I mean, that was like unrelated to the quote. I'm sure they loved it that she said that. This was on the record. This was no par for the course. So religious groups that the US disfavors, according to Ambassador Cook, are more likely to be classified as cults or extremists or whatever, and others are registered and protected as tolerant and orthodox. We can see the politics here, clear as day. This is really not something that makes it under the radar screen of all of these new offices, at least as far as I can tell. All right. A third concern about the adoption of religion as a platform from which to conduct foreign policy and human rights advocacy. This one is complicated and it's going to be hard to get through. I'm going to do what I can. We'll see where we get. It presumes kind of an understanding of religion, religious studies. This involves the kind of religious subject that is both presupposed and promoted through these programs and through these policies and through these various initiatives under the name of international religious freedom. This involves what it means to be religious and what it means to be modern, what it means to be free. So the current international regime of religious freedom emphasizes belief as the essence of religion. Belief is the core of religiosity. International experts spend a great deal of time, if you listen to them, discussing the right to choose to believe or not to believe. To be religious is to believe in one of a few major belief systems, often skewed a bit toward Christianity or token unbelief. So this approach reflects a particular understanding of religion and a particular understanding of the religious subject that emerged at a specific time and place, European Christianity, in the 17th century. It is not universal. So, as is well known in religious studies, to treat belief as the core of religion in this way is to sanctify and to sanction a particular religious psychology that relies on the notion of an autonomous subject who chooses beliefs and then enacts them. So this notion of belief and its relationship to the category of religion, as I said, dates to 17th century Europe. And I won't go into the details here, but I have a paper that's going to come out as part of a volume that we're publishing under the umbrella of our loose project called Politics of Religious Freedom, unless the press can come up with a better title, because we're getting kind of tired of same title for everything we do. But anyway, I go into the details in much more detail in this paper, but I just want to stress here that a specific notion of religion undergirds these contemporary advocacy efforts, and it produces subjects and also presupposes subjects for whom believing is taken as the defining characteristic of what it means to be religious, and then the right to choose one's belief or non-belief as the essence of what it means to be free. So this commitment to religion as chosen belief and to believers as religious choosers shapes the spaces in which people live out their religion in very particular ways. And this has been shown in the case of Kyrgyzstan. Matthias Pelkman's work, he does brilliant work on post-Soviet spaces and cultures and histories. And he's shown that after the fall of the Soviet Union, economic and religious liberalization and the war on terror kind of came together in this strange alignment and opened up particular kinds of spaces for the flourishing of Christian evangelical missions and the faltering of Muslim reformist movements in Kyrgyzstan. So he argues that the market model created very specific conditions in Kyrgyzstan favorable to Christian missions because it's encased in an international discourse in which Islam, except for certain folk varieties, is readily equated with radicalism and terrorism. So as a result, sectarian Protestant movements were classified as legitimate denominations, and Muslim reformist movements were perceived as possibly threatening to the government and suspected of links to terrorism. So working together and in tandem with free market ideology and the strategic imperatives of the war on terror, religious liberalization in Kyrgyzstan sanctioned particular ways of being religious that were understood to be modern and free. And in this model, individuals were free to choose their religious beliefs or non-beliefs as individuals, sort of like shopping in a marketplace for goods. To borrow Webb Keene's term, particular inhabitations of what the authorities perceived to be free, orthodox, and unthreatening religion were privileged, while other ways of relating to community, place, and tradition are rendered unintelligible or even maybe threatening. So Pelkman's finding resonates with what Courtney Bender has argued in the US case, which is that the failure or the inability of certain religious groups to participate in the free religious market is cast as a problem that's inherent to the groups themselves. It's a failure to assimilate, as a failure to cast off their religious peculiarities so they can participate, as she puts it, in the thriving religious commerce of modern democracy and in real free religiosity. So what I'm suggesting in this section to wrap up is that international religious freedom also relies on an autonomous individual subject distinguished by his or her right to choose belief or non-belief. Governing difference through religious freedom, through religious rights, through the right to believe or not to believe, protects and privileges those communities and those individuals that subscribe to this modern liberal understanding of faith, and there are many of them that are protected. They are, there's no way around it. And it excludes other ways of being beholden to communities beyond the self. As our fearless former ambassador at large put it, quote, anyone who identifies as a believer, though religious freedom is for believers and non-believers, she said that in parentheses, can come to our round table, end quote. So today, this believing or non-believing, freely chosen, market-based religious subject is being celebrated by the US, now Canadian, foreign policy establishments, disseminated through public international legal regimes, and normalized through everyday state administrative practices. Part of the strength and the appeal of this advocacy is drawn from its imbrication with a very powerful political discourse of freedom. Religiously liberated subjects are not brought into a particular American system or a particular capitalist system, a particular capitalist normative system. They are brought into freedom itself. Who could be against that? So, to wrap up, meeting last summer, Council on Foreign Relations, former US Ambassador to Nigeria gets up, John Campbell, and he starts talking about the causes of the current violence in Nigeria. And he says, he actually warns the audience not to fall prey to the temptation of describing the violence in Nigeria as religious in nature. He said, quote, "Are people in Nigeria being killed because they're Muslim, herders, or Hausa? It is often very hard to say," end quote. Now we can also ask, are the Rohingya being killed because of their religion, because they're depicted as immigrants, or because they're perceived as threatening to the political and economic business interests of the former junta? It's very hard to say. And the former junta, we can see now, may have their own views on this, supporting the religious persecution narrative as a means of displacing attention from their own complicity in persecuting Rohingya, which is what's going on. And I go into this in the paper. I can't go into it here, but Aung San Suu Kyi's party is a part of this persecution complex. It's actually quite astonishing. Almost everyone is against the Rohingya. It's a tragic situation. Similarly, shifting across the globe, Bashar al-Assad has profited from these dynamics, relying, as you know, for decades on the purported threat of sectarian chaos lying just below the surface of society to justify autocratic rule. As I've suggested, many factors lead to social exclusion, discrimination, and violence. The aftershocks of colonial displacement, economic inequalities, state persecution, business interests, social tensions, racial tensions, the list goes on and on. We completely lose sight of this bigger picture when we subscribe to a laser-like focus on redemption through religious rights. But the problem runs even deeper. We are also creating a world of persecuted religionists. Melanie McAllister has described this dynamic forcefully in a recent piece that she published. It's just a short article, like an op-ed in Religion Dispatches. McAllister was interviewing Sudanese refugees in Egypt, and they told her, quote, "If you want help, be a persecuted Christian," end quote. In Syria, advocacy for religious rights contributes to this political logic in which being Christian or Muslim, Sunni or Shia carries more public and political significance than being pro or anti-regime or pro or anti-democracy. So we are creating these divisions. Governing difference through the prism of religious rights, freedom, and toleration has become an industry. I have bumped up into this industry and they have tried to co-opt me, and it is absolutely phenomenal how much money and power and interest is behind it. It has created new categories of actors in global politics. It has spawned and sustained careers of many powerful people, many mandates, many commissions. It has naturalized new modes of social and religious organization. But far from a unitary settled norm that tames violence and mitigates insecurity and inequality, the right to religious freedom is simply one mode of framing and governing social difference. To deploy this discourse sets particular terms of engagement. It raises the profile of religion as a matter of difference and makes non-sectarian factors that contribute to social conflict less visible. Promoting Christian rights in Syria or Muslim rights in Myanmar generates what Bruno Latour calls a powerful truth about a contingent and fluid set of circumstances. So these divisions are real. So I can anticipate all the people saying, but what about in CAR right now? Yes, they become real through these processes, among others. Dissenters, doubters, those who identify with non-orthodox versions of protected traditions struggle to fit in this landscape. Some don't at all. And there is no political fix. There is no solution. And I will conclude by quoting an even more recent book by Latour. He says, "There is no right way to speak religiously. Who would dare claim he has the right, the precise, the definitive, the orthodox meta-language to talk about these things?" Thank you.
Thank
Do
you.
you need to sit or stand for questions?
Maybe stay.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah. So I'll move the mic around. I know there'll be a lot of questions, a wonderful talk, and I'll bring to the first, and I'll keep my eyes out for the rest. Dan.
Hi. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. So I first have a question sort of internal to your tripartite division, or three possible problems, and to suggest, I don't know if it's a fourth one or one that falls within the first, which is that conflicts in which certain minorities cannot represent themselves as members of a minority are less visible. In my example, is Kurds in Turkey and in Iraq. So they're Muslims, just like the majority group. And sometimes, like in Turkey, I think both are mostly Sunni Muslims. So they can't even say, oh, we're Shia versus Sunni or
Alavis
something.
too, but yeah.
And as far as I can tell, their claims for an independent state and so on have not been very successful throughout the years. And perhaps, I mean, I'm sure it's not the only reason,
Yes,
but part of the story.
I'm so glad you brought this up. This is terrific. Can I talk, or no, go. You finish. You finish.
So, okay.
I'm not going to jump in.
So the second question is...
Oh, a second question. Oh, I have to start taking notes because I have no short term.
Is more, for the lack of a better word, theoretical. So with regard to your third point, it suggested that a particular conception of religion, and perhaps it's more than just a particular conception of religion, it's a particular conception of the self. So
right.
This kind of Western self that started emerging in the 17th, 18th century of that you are an autonomous person to the extent that you make choices, and religious choice is just one of those choices that you make. Mm-hmm. And capitalism and all sorts of other things start emerging from that. Yeah. So to what extent, if you say, I don't like this, or this is a problematic conception, giving up on that will require you to give up much more than just this idea of promoting foreign policy through religion.
Okay, great, thank you. Yes, so I actually this is so interesting that you raise it, because I have this whole section. It's not about the Kurds, because I have this thing, I always end up writing about Turkey. I'm doing it again, and I'm just fascinated endlessly by Turkey, but not everyone shares that. So I actually have this section where I was writing about Guatemala, of all places, where there's this really interesting stuff going on that involves Mayan indigenous land rights claims that where it's actually another one of these kind of tragic oppressed situations where the mining companies and the government, and actually a number of these mining companies are Canadian, and the government have colluded and are basically just not acknowledging any sort of land rights claims that the Mayan indigenous people are making, and they're organizing into various communities. Some of you may not know a lot more about this than I do, but what's interesting to me here, and why this is to your point, is that this is an instance of what doesn't make it on the religious radar screen. So, and I have some other examples from Africa that are also very interesting. So you don't have religion, you don't have religious rights. It's impossible for you to even enter into this discursive frame in which you can then lock into this international set of resources and discourses and money and become a sort of received as a legitimate actor with a legitimate grievance that deserves some form of protection. Whether it's conceived as human rights protection or something else is less interesting to me. But you're absolutely right. And so who gets to make these claims and on what grounds? And I think that actually this is related to your second point in that whoever qualifies, what kind of particular conception of religion is operative in a particular circumstance is very much a part of this story, because the Mayans, these claims are, if you want to quibble over it, these are claims that are religious in nature, the land claims, and they're just not it's never been considered a religious rights issue. I don't think anyone's even talked about it in these terms. It just doesn't even register, and that's part of the reason that I was writing about it. Then I took it out because I realized that I was just getting way off track. But this is an important thing that you raised, because I think you're absolutely right. Now, in terms of do I want to get rid of this particular conception of the self and of the religious self that emerges 17th century Europe, et cetera, becomes globalized in particular ways. No, there's no way we're getting rid of it. I mean, look at Charles Taylor. What is it, 900 pages about this? We're not getting rid of it. It's here to stay. That's not the point. And this is something that's important to clarify that I should probably, I appreciate the opportunity to clarify, which is that I'm not going to get rid of any of this. I'm not single-handedly going to disestablish the Office of Religious Engagement as much as I would like to. These things are here to stay. These are powerful and perduring features of, our global lives now. And so the question is, how do we better understand them, first of all, and how do we understand them in specific contexts? So to know how that particular form of religious subjectivity becomes contested, instantiated, rejected, claimed, in a particular time and place is what Pelkmans does in the Kyrgyz case. And I think that kind of work, which is often ethnographic and anthropological in nature, is invaluable to people like me who want to make a more kind of global claim, but also invaluable to people who are living there and trying to understand what's going on in the world around them and what kinds of possibilities are available and what possibilities aren't available because they're not even imaginable. And of course, once they become unmanageable, you can hope that then there may be some way of finding resources to kind of actualize them and to think outside of the limits of these particular received categories and understandings of the self. I appreciate you using that word, actually, because that's, yeah, it is very much not, we're not talking just about a religious category here, but something much broader.
So we have our next question right here, and anyone else?
The problem with respect to law, religion, and politics in India is unique and complicated. In India, we have right to religion as fundamental right. And on the other hand, we have directive principle of state policy, which states that states shall endeavor to make uniform civil code for each and every citizen. Now, this code will be basically related to matrimonial affairs and more or less related to inheritance right. Now, the state is facing difficulty because the communities are saying that these fall within the domain of right to freedom of religion. Mm-hmm. Therefore, implementing uniform civil code is getting difficult in India. Now, Supreme Court of India has times and again reiterated in many cases wherein a person who is Hindu has a legally wedded wife, converts into Muslim, marries 3 more wives, take the inheritance benefit, converts back to Hindu. Now, these problem has created lot of complication in legal situation in India. But nothing has been done as of now because India, first of all, is a secular country. And secondly, it's a vote bank politics that happens in India.
Sorry,
therefore,
what kind of politics?
Vote bank, the religion-based
Yes.
vote bank
Right.
politics.
Uh-huh.
Till 64 years of independence, this uniform civil code has yet not been implemented.
Mm-hmm.
Now, my second, and I would just want to...
And you think it should be?
No, I just want
Or
to have
is
your
that
opinion
undeserved?
that to what extent this religious freedom should be given, or do you think that it should be narrowed down in the light of national integration, weeding out gender discrimination, which is prevalent in many personal laws? This is my first question. Now, the second question is, this uniform civil code has been interpreted in 2 ways. Some people say that there should be common law for all the religion. And some people say that the word uniform does not be misunderstood with the word common. Therefore, uniform principles should be there. The law may be different, but the principle should be uniformly applied. So, in these conditions, how do you see to reconcile the situation?
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, the issue of the Uniform Civil Code is extraordinarily complex, and the interests that would be served and disserved through its implementation is also, it's unclear, right? There are winners and there are losers, and there are really good arguments on both sides. So I wouldn't want to come down and make that kind of decision. But your question about religious freedom, should it be narrowed down in particular circumstances? I don't think it exists. I hope that that's clear. I don't think that, I mean, when you live under a modern state, there is no such thing as religious freedom in an absolute sense. I mean, this is part of the argument that Winnie Sullivan made in The Impossibility of Religious Freedom that I think is really important to look at, and she develops it in a specific American legal and religious and historical context, so it's not about India, to be clear. But the point is that I don't think religious freedom is an abstract principle that's just out there, or this sort of normative ideal that exists in some concrete sense that can be then narrowed down or expanded, or I don't think that that's what we're talking about here, and that's part of what our project is trying to show. And so I would encourage you, actually, if you're interested in this, to go and look at, we had a series of workshops as part of the Loose Politics of Religious Freedom project, and the one that focused on South and Southeast Asia is most relevant to the debates that you're referencing here. And it actually couldn't take place in India, although it was supposed to for complicated reasons having to do with people's visas. But it took place instead in Chiang Mai in northern Thailand. But we had a number of prominent scholars, including some legal activists who are engaged in some of these debates, who were there and who presented papers. And all of that information is up on our website. So to get at some of the nuance and some of the debates over the Uniform Civil Code, which is an extraordinary complex issue, I would refer you to them as opposed to trying to pass judgment myself on it, because I have been, I've sat in on these conversations and seen the complexities and the different interests at stake, and it's not at all clear to me that there is an answer that, one answer that's going to be the answer to solve this issue. But I appreciate you raising it.
So we have Bruce, the next question, and then there were a couple of hands I saw as well. Good, so with a lot of hands, and so we'll maybe do our best to limit ourselves to one question, at most 1.5.
1.5. You're tough, Ben.
Yeah, well, let me see if I can pull it off. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Elizabeth. That was a really thought-provoking talk. I enjoyed that a great deal. And as I was listening to your critique of the problems with deploying religion in these political activities, it was hard not to think of similar kinds of critiques of identity politics
Yes.
in different
Yes.
contexts. And I guess, the struggles I'm most familiar with have been decades worth of debates about relying on gender or sex as a fixed category, but we can think of all.
Ethnicity, yeah.
Yeah, the point, kind of anti-essentialist critiques have been made in so many different contexts, and I work in the area of anti-discrimination law, so familiar with the importance of recognizing the complexity of people's identity through intersectionality and that whole
Right,
body of
right.
literature. So I'm wondering where that leads me in this context is trying to think of what does an anti-essentialist political practice that recognizes the complexity of people's identities and is not blind to the reality of religious persecution look like? And I know that's a huge question, but I'm wondering if you could offer us a few thoughts on it.
Well, first of all, I would have to contest the not blind to religious persecution, because I think whenever we see that term, we need to flag it and unpack it. And as I gave with the example of the Rohingya, and we could give numerous, I'm sure everyone has another example, other examples that would be relevant to this, that this is always a bigger story. It's always a more complex story. And so I would want to unpack that first and try to figure out who's making the claim that this is religious persecution and why. And then what is actually going on the ground in these specific situations or scenarios. Now, in terms of what does an anti-essentialist political practice look like, that's a really big question. And I'm not sure that I can answer that in any satisfactory way standing here in front of you. I guess one thing to say is to think about in some of the ways that you've been thinking in sophisticated registers about the categories of gender, race, ethnicity, other identity categories, that we also do the same with religion, but also that we don't assume that all of the dynamics are just the same. So in other words, we can't just kind of substitute in, kind of add religion and stir. So I think that we do have to recognize that while there are commonalities between the politics that ensue when we mobilize particular identities and instantiate them in law and use them in various modes of governance, there are all kinds of costs associated with that, as you know, and that we do need to kind of step back and resist that. At the same time, there are differences that the category of religion has its own history. It has a very specific and complex history that's bound up with the emergence of the category in the Middle Ages in Europe, the church state, the emergence of religion as a category. It's also bound up in a whole host of colonial encounters around the world, as so many scholars have shown so convincingly. So it is its own thing, and it does mobilize its own histories and its own particular kind of dynamics of power and persuasion. And so I would just ask for, while recognizing the commonalities with these other categories and the need for an anti-essentialist move, that we also grapple with the specificities of religion as a category and its history, rather than just kind of adding it onto the long list of things that we need to be anti-essentialists about. Is that?
No, that's really
Okay. Thanks for the question. It's a good question.
I'm conscious I've done a very bad job of asking people to introduce themselves along the way. If you might begin that as you go, and sir.
Is it on?
It is. It's not amplifying. It's just
Oh yeah, and your affiliation, so I know what department you're in.
My name's Gerald Filson. I happen to be the chair of the Canadian Interfaith Conversation, and I'm the public affairs director for the Baha'i Community of Canada.
Right.
And I think what you said was absolutely terrific on many, many points. I couldn't be more agreeable. I mean, the point about the reification of religious categories, that happens in interfaith too. It in fact is a kind of a conservative, it stratifies people into certain representation of religion, and it doesn't really allow for the evolution of religion. I've just read Peter Van der Veer's book on the spirit of Asia, so I'm all about the fact that religions appropriate from each other, and it goes very rapidly. I
He's
think
a great
many.
example of what
Yeah,
you were
that's
asking
right.
for.
What he said, and your
Excellent.
response you just made was very good. I mean, I think what's important is any exclusive attention to any particular right, rather than the whole range of human rights, is prone though to the kind of criticisms you made. I mean, you can make that criticism about, as you say, multiculturalism too. If you just look at cultural categories or gender categories or whatever, so so there's a whole range of criticisms you have which are like that, which are criticisms you can make of any kind of, and also social policy. There's always an over-bureaucratization of social policy, and the government has been ham-handed, there's no question, about religion as it's resurged in the last 2 decades. That being said, I think the dialogue you could have with people who do feel that for a long time religious freedom was eclipsed in the human rights universe, I think that dialogue is important to carry forward. So I have a couple of questions on that. One is the fact that in many ways the definitions of the religious, the reification of the definition or the blocking into discrete categories is actually made by the persecutors or by certain state government laws. That the reference to India is one in case, where the census now is taken, you have to identify your religion, you also have to identify your caste.
You have to identify your religion to get a visa to go to India.
Yeah, so that consequently
new,
the evolution of religion, or the kind of these fringe categories or people moving from one to another, is blocked and stopped because of that. But that being the case, then the impact on freedoms or on rights, and the whole category of rights, not just religious freedom, is in fact made very difficult. So you do have to pay attention to the religious category. So I was glad to hear what you just said in the answer to that. It's an important category. So I wanted to raise that question. And then I also wanted to say, I mean, I do think some of the things you say, it is a bit of a caricature to say, I think you've overdrawn the power of the religious freedom debate. I mean, I know I'm acquainted with Bennett in the Foreign Affairs Department. His budget's $5 million in a department which is millions and millions of dollars. And the fact is they have done everything possible to integrate that with the whole range of human rights. I'm not saying it's perfect, but it has, in fact, I think, balanced what was overbalanced before in the eclipse of religion. I think in terms of poverty too, you have to find representatives and leaders of poverty groups to deal with that. And then what you do then is you give them a certain authority, and people make careers out of that. So that's why I say, I think in your criticism, you have to kind of categorize those criticisms which can be made of any social policy, and those criticisms which are exclusive to the religious freedom debate. And I think too, you have to be very careful in comparing the Religious Freedom Office in the States to the one in Canada. I followed both the history of the last 2 decades, and it is very different. They're different. And Bennett, much to my surprise, has turned out to be very, very good on some of these issues. Partly because he doesn't have a religious freedom doctorate, he has a political science doctorate, but there's a whole story to be told there.
Wow,
No,
that's the
I
first
think
time
it's
I've heard
critical.
that.
No, his degrees in political science.
I've got a future here in ambassadorship. Well, the position is unfilled in the U.S.
So just that
So,
answer about the
You can
persecutor.
start dropping hints.
I'm sorry to have gone so fast, but the key question then is that when the persecutors define the religious group and when the state does, then there is, I think, some role. And there's a continuum of mixed issues, and ones which are more purely religious. So
I think definitions of religion are made by all kinds of people, not just persecutors. And academics are actually one of the biggest generators of definition of religion. The field of religious studies is an enormous source of definitions. And so I wouldn't want to limit it, but I do appreciate your comment that we pay attention to who is creating these categories and who's generating them and for what political purposes, and that's precisely part of what I'm interested in here in studying these dynamics. I don't buy the story that religion was marginalized and now it's back. I think that's a myth that I actually have sought to take apart in the politics of secularism, which shows that religion has never disappeared and always occupied very different spaces and different forms under different forms of governance, secular forms of governance, what we understand to be secular forms of governance. So I think that has been taken apart and sort of complexified by a number of scholars in the field of secular religious studies over the past decade and a half, 2 decades. So I don't really buy that story, but I do think, but I do accept that there are definitely differences between the US and the Canadian office. When I was over in London a few weeks ago, and they wanted to talk about the Europeans, and they said, well, we're going to do it right. We're not going to do what you guys did. We're going to do all of these other things better and different. Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't buy it. You're not going to be able to convince me because, as I said, I think that this sets in motion particular kinds of political dynamics that are ultimately creating the very problems that they're purporting to solve. So I'm not going to be convinced that there's a sort of better model and a less better model of promoting religious freedom, but I will be convinced, and I am convinced, that there are very different consequences when the US does something and the Canadians do something and when the Europeans do something, and that the actual understandings of religion and of freedom and of what it means to employ this as a mode of governance in other countries or as a tool in trade sanctions, the Europeans are interested in using it. They're actually writing into trade agreements certain forms of conditionality that then hinge on the protection of religious minorities. These all operate completely differently, and they unfold differently in different contexts too. They may resonate in some contexts, they may fall flat in others. So yes, the call for particularity and specificity is definitely welcome. I agree with you there.
Hi, I'm Samuel Weiss. I'm a fourth-year undergrad student here in political science. Your third point in terms of defining religion as practice born out of a belief system, I was actually wondering if it might be reversed, which is practice that then creates a belief system, or at least feeds into a belief system. The first questioner mentioned Turkey. I think that you can make the same argument for Israel and the kind of conflict between the Reform movement and the Orthodox community in terms of how the country behaves and where the laws are drawn out from. And I'm curious if it might be more prudent to define these terms based on what people are doing rather than, this more esoteric notion of what they think or how they think.
Okay, so there's a bit of a disconnect here. I'm talking very, and maybe I wasn't clear enough, very specifically about a particular discursive regime, which is this regime of international religious freedom, and the kinds of understandings of religion, of religious subjectivity, and understandings of the self that inhabit it and that have animated it and that continue to shape it in particular ways. I'm not suggesting that that particular understanding of the self characterizes the practice of religion. In fact, quite the opposite. I'm suggesting that there are all kinds of practices that of course lead to beliefs and lead to all kinds of different things, and then for many religions the category of belief itself is not particularly salient or relevant. Okay. So yeah, that is something. In fact, the gap between the actual lived experience of religion and the religion that's promoted and tolerated and advocated for by these various projects, that gap is what interests me, and the fact that there is that mismatch and that actually leads to, I think, some of the nefarious consequences that I've been trying to suggest come out of these projects that suggest they need to be reconsidered from a political standpoint. So I think we agree on that.
This is Madison, please go ahead. And then I have my eyes on other people here.
This lady over here had her hand up too.
If you had a question, good. I've got it.
Hi, I'm Madison Robbins, second-year law student here at Osgood. So I was really interested in how you talked about sort of the promotion of orthodoxy and religious authority and this sort of monolithic presentation of the religion in a sort of outward-facing way, trying to be the face of the religion to the international community, and how this can result in interreligious violence and persecution. But how does that work internally to the religion? Is the same sort of orthodoxy inward focused? Do we see the sort of same violence towards heretical groups or the different denominations within the groups, or the silencing of them, or violence in that way? Or do we just are we not able to articulate it within the language of religious freedom in the way that it's constituted in the international discussion right now?
So one of the things, it's a great question, one of the things I'm suggesting that we need to do, and that religious freedom makes it difficult to do as a discursive regime and as kind of a disciplining logic, is to ask that question and to actually open up what's going on. And this gets back to what this gentleman was saying too, what's going on inside of these various communities, whether they're called religious communities or secular communities, makes absolutely no difference to me. But what is going on in terms of the infra-community dynamics? And there's been really interesting work on this done. I know some of it done in Lebanon that I just came across recently, but this is one of the things that gets kind of skated over or obfuscated or obscured through the logic of religious freedom, is that we don't have as much access to those dynamics. But what I was suggesting specifically is not so much that this causes violence between religions, but rather that the logic itself it presupposes and it elicits these particular forms of kind of hierarchical identification that require communities that may not have, maybe they didn't think of themselves as a religion, or they didn't care, they were indifferent to this question, or they didn't have a particular leader it sort of imposes this take me to your imam, as people have said to me, mentality on a community that may not have necessarily resonated with previously. So it's this kind of disciplining logic that I see, and that has particular consequences, but I'm hesitant, and here's where I will jump off the causal train. I'm hesitant to generalize and say that every time you promote religious freedom, it's going to, suddenly you're going to have this, or religious engagement really, this is more of a different chapter that I didn't talk about today, where you're going to have this creation of this, this little bubble with, your leader at the top and everybody in the bottom and people sort of pushed aside. It's not going to be that clear, but I'm suggesting that it does incentivize particular kinds of understanding of what it means to be a religion. And one of those is that, yes, you have a leader, you have a text, you have an orthodoxy, and and this is not something, just to be clear, that that I've discovered. This is, if you go back and read Webb Keene's book, it's really incredibly rich discussions of this in the anthropological literature of how these processes of modernization, understandings of modern selfhood, going back to the first question, have been transmitted globally and the kinds of consequences that they have locally, which vary enormously. And that's why I would go the anthropological route or the ethnographic route and say we have to look carefully to specific context before we just generalize. So I wouldn't say it just causes violence. I would say let's look at, it incentivizes particular forms of identification and inning and outing and overcoding of the boundaries, particular authorities and hierarchies, but it's not necessarily causing violence. Does that get at it? So it's just a little bit stepping back, I guess, from some of the claims.
Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. Actually, I'm very glad that you have brought the issue of Rohingya issues into discussion.
I'm sorry, could you tell me who you are, please?
My name is Zaglul Haider. I'm a PhD candidate at Osgood.
At Osgood, great.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
I'm very glad that you have brought the Rohingya issue. The Rohingya issue, actually, the whole world is watching the persecution of Rohingyas since 70s or late 70s. And I remember that in late 70s, the Rohingyas first crossed the border of Bangladesh and
yeah.
got in. And
Yes.
right now, almost 200,000 Rohingyas are getting refuge in Bangladesh. And Bangladesh is in such a situation, Bangladesh cannot afford to give refuge to any more Rohingyas.
Yes.
And several times Bangladesh denied
Yes.
denied to give them shelter. As a result, a lot of Rohingyas have seen they have just sunken in the ocean.
Yes. Yes, they are.
So
Yes, it's
at
horrible.
this point, the global players, especially the USA, European Union, and China. China has got tremendous influence in Yangon,
Yes.
but still all of them are very silent about the Rohingya issue. But I don't know why. Do you know? Do you have an answer?
Well, I think that being pro-Rohingya in general, for all of those actors that you mentioned, both the global and the regional and the local, is sort of like being against religious freedom in the U.S. It is politically impossible. So this is in a sense, this is why the situation of the Rohingya drew my attention, because it is a situation in which you have people across the political spectrum in Burma, and you have business interests, and you have regional players like China, you're right, and you have local, global, international community who are, for the most part, not doing very much. Now there are some exceptions. There have been some calls for justice. There have been documentaries made. Some journalists are in there trying to get information, but the situation is extraordinarily dire. It's incredible. And people are basically being held as prisoners in villages that are effectively prison camps, and they're not allowed to leave, even go to the hospital or to see family members. It's bad. So this is what's interesting here. Is what I'm trying to suggest is that I think that the emphasis on, well, we have to bring religious freedom to these people in Burma and that they're persecuted Muslims, is actually impeding recognition of the enormous political complexity of the Rohingya situation, and the fact that the former junta is still exercising enormous power in Burma and is impeding any sort of real attempt to deal with the problem. And China is a part of the story too. We can't leave out any of the regional actors, because you're absolutely right. Now there have been, who was it that I was just with who was in Rangoon? He was headed to Rangoon. Anyway, the guy at BU, Bob, I'll think of his name in 2 seconds, Hefner, thank you. Bob Hefner was going to Rangoon to meet with the Burmese, with the junta guys, with the Aung San Suu Kyi party leaders, with the representatives of the Rohingya, with representatives from a number of places around the region, including the Chinese, to try to talk about this problem. So, I mean, people know that it's an issue, and what's interesting to me is how is it framed as an issue, and what are the problems that are identified, and what are the problems that we can't see because those that are in power are just not letting us see them. And the fact and the reality of the Rohingya and the understood as a threat to the economic interests of the former junta is something that we don't see anywhere. And I think the religious freedom discourse is making it possible to displace a whole lot of the politics and the economics behind the persecution of the Rohingya onto the category of persecuted Muslims. So,
Aung San Suu Kyi, she's regarded for respect for human rights throughout the world, but she's not supporting the Rohingya cause too.
She's, well, a number of members of her party aren't supporting the Rohingya cause, and she has been on kind of waffling, so taking two sides.
So I have 3 people on the list. We're working Professor Shakman Hurd very hard, and she's rising to it. We have
Oh no, I'm having fun. We should just keep going.
Somebody has Preet is going to ask a question, and then Hangame and Patricia. And if you're interested in the question, and I'll just keep my eyes on it, I'll do my best. So just signal me if you have a question as well.
Thanks for your talk today. My name's Preet Verdi. I'm from SOAS in London.
Oh,
and,
cool. I'm going there in like 3 weeks and giving a talk.
Oh, lovely. Yeah,
Yes.
it's a great place to have these conversations. And I think being in London for the last 3 years and returning back to Canada, what I found really interesting is this, like the overwhelming discussion in Europe and the UK about secularism.
Yes.
And its
Yes.
conflict with religious plurality, right? So I was
Alleged
really...
conflict.
Yeah.
Which is all internal
Alleged.
to secularism.
Certainly,
itself, right?
yeah. And so what I found really thought-provoking about this analysis was the identification of the self at the root of religious freedom advocacy internationally. So I just wanted to know more about what you thought about how this category of religious freedom operationalized internationally through policy comes up against these group rights or kinship rights that are sometimes more appropriate in explaining sort of phenomenon that I see like empirically within South Asian communities, but that we don't know how to talk about except by using the word religion in order to garner the interest by others in the work that you do. So I just wanted to know more of what you thought on that.
So I have a book for you, which maybe you've already read. It's not my book. Cassie Adcock's new book, C.S. Adcock. She wrote a book that is basically a history of the emergence of religion as a category in colonial India and the relationship to the tolerance movement and the ways in which it displaced a whole politics of caste and is very much imbricated with these questions of group rights and what are the languages that are available in which to articulate certain kinds of claims and certain kinds of claims that we now understand to be religious claims. And she's looking very specifically at the should-be movement, the proselytizing movement. So it's a specific, very historically contextualized study. And I think that is actually the sort of a model for scholarship in this area for thinking about, so what are the languages in which we are able to make certain kinds of claims now, and what sorts of limitations do they impose on various forms of subjectivity, whether they're individual or more collectively understood. So I would recommend that. And I think that the historical, I've been sort of touting the ethnographic approach, but this historical angle is incredibly invaluable. Another person's work who I'd recommend is Nandini Chatterjee, who has written on a number of things, among them the sort of more recently the practices of Mughal India, the legal practices or practices for managing religious difference and diversity through the law, and how those practices would never sort of make any sense in our understanding of religious freedom, but open up all different kinds of understandings and possibilities for thinking about how to exist with difference and diversity in a socially complex historical situation or landscape. So those are sort of historical and also imaginative exercises. I think that both Cassie and Nandini are doing really cutting edge work in that area, so I'd point you to them.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Thanks so much, Hangame Feburary here at Osgood. I just wanted to thank you so much. This is just absolutely wonderful in the way it adds layers of richness to what some of the more quote-unquote critical works in international human rights are doing from a law perspective. And the reason that is that the layers of richness are exactly in the fact that you are specifying exactly what is that has been essentialized, what is this process of reification. When human rights lawyers, usually the critical approaches, they only talk about it mostly in abstract. There are recent work, obviously, that are changing that, but it's mostly in abstract. And it's simply because you guys, political scientists and historians, are much more literate and much more educated in adding that layer of specificity. And I guess I'm trying to ask for something more now, or to ask if you're taking this any further. And the question is as follows. So when human rights lawyers, when those critical approaches, they engage with this concept of reification, essentialization, and all of that, they mostly take the discursive approach that you're taking here as well. And they do it in a number of different ways. Obviously, as you just said, in different fields, in different subjects, and thematically also, we can't really come up with a general way of doing it. So when they talk about what feminist voices in transnational activities in international criminal justice have been doing, how they have been harming women sometimes more than helping. They are taking a discursive approach. They start from looking at the way international institutions, NGOs, are taking this lexicon, this feminist lexicon, in its various manifestations, obviously, and how that language in and of itself reifies something, right? And sometimes they switch the focus. They just look at the very detailed negotiations over international treaties, over statutes of international criminal bodies, et cetera, to see basically where the interests of women might be sacrificed throughout this, the processes of the evolution of this language or lexicon. When people who talk about child soldiers, they just look at cultural diversity, different definitions of childhood, all of those. And one way to look at all of this, one way of doing it that lawyers are not very good at it, and maybe political scientists can add, is in this particular case, which is not really so much discursive anymore because it becomes really more phenomenological, or it becomes sociological, where you would look at the interplay of the dynamic of identity, how these identities, the religious identities, could be more fluid, and how this fluidity could be used, in different international negotiations when we look at the role of these different religious groups, and how they were trying to use the fluidity of this dynamic of this identity, and how basically this essentialized language or harmonized language shut that up. Is that something that you think you're interested in, or do you think that kind of...
That's fabulous. Yes. Sign me up. Sounds like a good next project. That's excellent. And I like the constructive gesture there and the move. What kept coming to mind while you were speaking was this question of, when you were talking about gender in particular, some of the gender dynamics are particularly interesting here that I've come across. And I don't think that I've been able to do them justice in this particular book, but I do think that we see a sort of corralling of women in a very particular way. There's like the interfaith group, and then there's the women's group, right? And there is and these groups. This is not only the government initiatives. I'm thinking here of Religions for Peace and a lot of these huge global organizations and NGOs that are doing the actual engagement between groups. There's an interesting dynamic that I think you're suggesting needs to be countered, or needs to be creatively and constructively countered in a way that is more empirical than what I'm doing. And I'm very much sympathetic to that call. I think that would require, Ben and I have talked about this, that would require a particular kind of sociological and ethnographic work in order to get on the ground and talk to people and figure out, identify some of these dynamics that you're suggesting. You use the term, I think you said, religious fluidities, or kind of the moving back and forth between these boundaries, and how could that capacity be mobilized in particular circumstances to counter or to overcome or to stick a needle in the eye of some of these projects that are irking all of us for all of these reasons that we've been talking about. So I think that's a fantastic suggestion. I'm not sure that I can do it, but I really appreciate it because right now I'm trying to write the conclusion to my book, and I'm trying to think about different ways that this question can be opened up more constructively rather than only critically. So I'm really extraordinarily grateful to you for raising that. Thank you.
Patricia Hughes. I'm the Executive Director of the Law Commission of Ontario, which is located here in the building. And I'm going to use a 0.5 first because
Sorry,
it's
what's the
a
Law
point.
Commission of Ontario?
We look at the laws in Ontario to see how they should be changed
Okay.
and reformed.
So
It's a law reform commission.
You're a law professor then?
No,
Okay.
it's
You're a law
irrelevant.
commission
Yeah.
member. Okay. Just trying to-
I have been a law professor.
A reformed-
Yeah, I'm a
reformed
reforming law professor. Yeah.
Reformed and reforming.
I would like to be, again, a law professor.
Sorry for the distraction.
That's okay. So one thing that I quickly thought about as something I'd been interested in years ago, but it brought it back to me, your discussion, and it's not a foreign policy kind of thing, but more the domestic. And it was the example of the Irish independence movement.
Yes.
Where you know it's treated as a Catholic versus
Yes.
Protestant
Great
dispute,
example.
and of course the whole thing
Right.
is all about economic power, political power,
course, in history.
and the coincidence of religious belief and some of those particular divisions. So it struck me that's an interesting kind of,
Yes.
I was going to say historical example, except it's not over, so,
No.
but primarily a historical example, but in a domestic context.
Yes. Yes.
But what I was interested in as well, and I recognize that you are talking about foreign policy. I'm cognizant of what you said in relation to the example of Israel that was raised. So one of the things that interests me is the way, and I think underlies in a way what you're saying, is the convenient definition of religious freedom, or the way in which how we define people's coming to their beliefs in a convenient way for whatever purpose we want to do it. So in your case, you're talking about how this is all part of the autonomous person, and so we're protecting that, and so forth and so on.
In the market.
In the market,
In the
yeah.
marketplace.
Yeah. And foreign policy through the marketplace as well, and that's certainly true of Canada, I think. But then I'm wondering how that interrelates to some extent with the internal ways of seeing the coming to religious belief or religious values. And so just thinking about Canada, for example, how did we squeeze religious belief, religion as a form of discrimination, into our equality provision in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms by saying it's something you don't easily change. In other words, it isn't really an autonomous decision. It's something that somehow you come to, and you're protected in it because, you know, this is really, to use the expression that was used from the United States, it's immutable, or almost immutable, we had to say. Now, that's an old-fashioned way of seeing other parts of the equality rights provision as well, but nevertheless, it's what underlies our protection of religion in that context. I look at Quebec and the secular drive there, where it's really, this is all a choice, right? So we've got both these kinds of discourses going on,
Yes.
parallel tracks in Canada that have created some very interesting kind of dynamics around how we think about that. And I'm just curious as to whether what you've been doing has picked up.
Yes.
You know, you've got the one level, and then if you go below it into the internal dynamics, what kinds of conflicts might be arising there if you identify?
Right. Well, in what you're saying reminds me of one of my co-conspirators in our Loose project, Peter Danchen's work. And he looks specifically at the conflicts that arise internal to the right itself. And this is obviously wherever the right is mobilized, whether it's domestically or in some international legal instrument. So I'm absolutely. And those tensions internal to the right and the ways in which it collides and conflicts with other rights and the ways in which it's kind of different claims are made on different grounds and different contexts. I mean, this is why this is such fertile terrain. So I'm not sure that I have an answer other than to suggest that when you say internal, I think you mean domestic.
Well, I'm just thinking when you frame it as the autonomous, for the purpose of the way in which the foreign policy is being used for purposes of foreign policy in the marketplace. Have you seen in those analyses a tension between that level and then within the countries?
Yes.
The tension between that level and how it's perceived within the country.
Yes, and the variation between countries and even within countries, between regions, is astonishing.
And what effect that might
and
have.
what effect that has. So yes, absolutely. And part of the job that I have in writing this book is to delimit who exactly I'm talking about when I identify a particular understanding of religious freedom and when it's mobilized by whom, when, where. And that's a real challenge because you're absolutely right that these many of these same dynamics are definitely going on internal, but in very different registers. So, and when I cited Courtney Bender about sort of this, who qualifies as sort of legitimately part of the religiously free marketplace and who's just sort of too peculiar and needs to be kind of reformed, and then they can come and join us. That is a particular dynamic that's very much an American story, and it probably has, operates in a different register here and in different, very differently here, and again, very differently in France, and again, very differently in Myanmar for that. So this, I very much agree with you, and I don't mean to suggest that there is some sort of universal formula of religious freedom that can somehow, just sort of exist in some ideal, Bavarian way in these different countries that is somehow all the same. No, to the contrary. And unpacking the specificity of those histories is precisely why we organized this project. Right. So that's what it does. So I appreciate your comment very much.
Well, I'm just going to ask to keep your attention for a moment or two. We'll thank Professor Shakman Hurd in just a moment, but I wanted to say you can see now why I was relatively comfortable in a sabbatical year having only one session of the colloquium, because we only needed one session of the colloquium this year.
A lot of pressure, Ben.
Next year there'll be at least 4 people coming through, and if you're not signed up for the colloquium list, just Google Osgood Colloquium on Law, Religion, and Social Thought, and you can put your name onto the mailing list and look forward to a rich year of talks next year. Now, when we thank, we've kind of started a tradition. One element of the thank you is the poster.
I love it.
You've seen the normal sort of Osgood thank you gift, but Professor Shakman Hurd is also from Minnesota.
Is it maple syrup?
No, a very. It's a mug. It's a mug. But there's another thing. And as a good Minnesotan, a strong hockey fan, and so it seemed appropriate also.
You deserve the. Yay! I needed these.
So please join me.
Thank you all. Thank you. I'll put them on right now.
There's lots of food. Please take something on your way out.
Thanks, everybody. Great discussion.
This is also for you.